Is truly one of my favorite shows on the Reels channel and Reels Plus app. Every Friday and Saturday night, they follow police officers across the country in these high-stakes ride-along with over 50 cameras rolling live, capturing all the actions in real time. As you can imagine, the incidents caught on camera are quite wild. From high-speed chases to daring rescues to intense standoffs, everything in between, it just never stops.
From the charging documents and police interviews were not only horrifying, but pointed to a sustained and deliberate campaign of abuse. Prosecutors claimed the abuse was chronic, intentional, and even spelled out in cold text messages between the accused. Jesse Weber, host of Sidebar from Law and Crime, outlined how deeply disturbing the case had become. Before diving into the full horror, he reminded viewers about the newly launched On Patrol Live YouTube channel, but quickly returned to the subject of the little girl, known only as CW in court documents. It was the morning of June 28, 2025, when Sandy police arrived at the residence and were greeted by Leary, who led them to the basement. There, CW was found limp and silent on a bed, her body tinged with greenish-blue bruises and lacking oxygen. Officer Ron Butler noted multiple bruises under her eyes and discoloration over her entire body. She was immediately rushed to Primary Children's Hospital, where doctors diagnosed her with a complex skull fracture, subgaleal and subdural hemorrhaging, and extensive injuries to her soft tissue. Dr. Anuan Atlaski stated that the injuries were far beyond what could be expected from a toddler, suggesting repeated and violent trauma. Jesse then turned to former Salt Lake County District Attorney Jeremy Diaz to unpack the legal implications. Diaz explained that attempted aggravated murder is among the most serious charges, elevated here by the prolonged abuse and torture, which legally shifts the charge from simple abuse to a premeditated attempt on a child's life. Even if the defense attempts to argue that CW's injuries were accidental or the result of typical toddler behavior,
every Friday
the
and
consistent
Saturday night,
pattern of
they follow
injury and
police
the expert
officers across the
testimony
country
paint a
in
much
these
darker
high-stakes
picture.
ride-along
Moreover,
with
text
over 50
messages
cameras
between Leary
rolling
and
live,
Balone
capturing all
reinforced
the
the
actions
sinister
in real
narrative,
time.
showing
As you can
mounting
imagine,
frustration,
the incidents caught on
violent
camera are
threats, and
quite
apathy
wild.
toward the
From
child's
high-speed
well-being.
chases to daring
Despite being aware
rescues
of
to
the
intense
injuries,
standoffs,
Leary
everything in
allegedly left
between, it just
CW
never
care
stops.
and delayed medical attention, citing Balone's threats and pleas not to call emergency services. In police interviews, she claimed she returned home on the morning of June 28 after Balone called and told her something was wrong. He admitted to throwing CW onto a bed where she ricocheted and hit the wall, yet neither called 911, out of fear of jail, and Leary, allegedly, out of manipulation. Investigators believe that this incident was the culmination of weeks of abuse. Texts, dating back to June 21, showed Balone threatening to murder CW, while Leary responded apologetically but failed to intervene. Police say Balone admitted to spanking, punching, and throwing the child, even using graphic imagery to describe how her body bounced like a rock skipping over water before hitting the wall. He even admitted to previously striking her in the face multiple times. The tipping point came when he called his mother, also a nurse practitioner, rather than emergency services. His mother urged them to take CW to the hospital, and she may have ultimately called 911 herself. Leary later used a moment alone to secretly send the home address and summon help. Investigators also noted that CW had been kept home from daycare to hide visible bruising. Under Utah law, a mother who knowingly allows abuse without acting can be held equally responsible, and Leary's failure to act, despite witnessing signs of abuse and receiving admissions from Balone, placed her firmly in the crosshairs of the law. When asked whether Leary could claim coercion as a defense, Diaz explained, it may mitigate but not excuse her role.
It's truly one of my favorite shows on the Reels channel and Reels Plus app. Every Friday and Saturday night, they follow police officers across the country in these high-stakes ride-along with over 50 cameras rolling live, capturing all the actions in real time. And as you can imagine, the incidents caught on camera are quite wild. From high-speed chases to daring rescues to intense standoffs, everything in between, it just never stops.
The damage to CW's skull, bruises of varying ages, and lack of medical care all aligned with a deliberate and escalating pattern of abuse. During his police interview, Balone admitted to knocking the girl with a closed fist and described specific hits to her forehead and temple. He even downplayed the trauma, blaming her behavioral regressions, but texts revealed intent, like, "I'm about to crack her skull," and his refusal to FaceTime his mother, who pleaded to see the child's condition, suggested consciousness of guilt. Ultimately, both Leary and Balone were arrested and now face multiple first-degree felony charges, each carrying potential life sentences. Salt Lake County District Attorney Sim Gill urged struggling parents to seek help instead of letting frustration turn into tragedy, stating, "We're meant to protect our children, not harm them." Despite the grim facts, Gill's words echoed as a haunting reminder of a life almost lost to silence and inaction. This was Sidebar, and Jesse Weber signed off, urging viewers to stay informed and always choose intervention over apathy when a child's safety is on the line. As court proceedings loom, both defendants remain in custody. facing the weight of the state's evidence and the profound moral revulsion that accompanies crimes against children. Prosecutors have signaled they will push for maximum sentences, and the legal community is already bracing for a high-profile trial that could become a landmark. Case for how Utah prosecutes aggravated child abuse. Meanwhile, the child miraculously, still alive, remains under close medical supervision. Doctors have not released full details about her prognosis, but early statements suggest a long, painful road to recovery,
they follow
both
police
physically
officers
and
across the
emotionally.
country in these
Child welfare
high-stakes
agencies have
ride-alongs
launched a
with over
parallel
50 cameras
investigation to
rolling live,
determine
capturing
how,
all
in
the actions in real
2025,
time.
a child
And
could
as you can
suffer such
imagine, the
extensive
incidents
abuse
caught on
without
camera are
intervention.
quite
The
wild.
role of
From
neighbors,
high-speed
daycare
chases to
providers,
daring
and even
rescues to
employers of
intense
the two
standoffs,
accused
everything
are
in
under
between, it just
scrutiny,
never
though many
stops.
questions remain unanswered. Were there missed warning signs? Could anyone have stepped in sooner? Inside the courtroom, early hearings have seen neither defendant show visible remorse. Both have retained legal counsel, and a gag order has now been requested to prevent pretrial publicity from tainting a potential jury pool. Defense attorneys have hinted they may attempt to shift blame between the two, suggesting that while abuse may have occurred, their individual clients were manipulated, misled, or merely negligent, not murderous. But prosecutors are expected to lean heavily on the digital trail, the text messages, the medical records, and the chilling sequence of events as described in police interviews, with no credible third-party witness to the abuse. Much will rest on the credibility of the defendant's own words already embedded in call logs, written confessions, and electronic records. The community of Sandy, Utah, meanwhile, is reeling. Local residents have begun organizing prayer vigils for the child, and online forums are flooded with outrage and calls for justice. This case, for many, is not only about punishment but about the systemic failure that allowed it to go unnoticed. In upcoming hearings, the state is expected to introduce evidence from medical experts, trauma specialists, and digital forensics analysts to establish both the timeline and severity of the alleged abuse. Forensic pathologists are preparing to testify about the difference between accidental toddler injuries and those caused by deliberate blunt force trauma, hoping to leave no doubt in jurors' minds about intent. In the background,
It's truly one of my favorite shows on the Reels channel and Reels Plus app every Friday and Saturday night. They follow police officers across the country in these high-stakes ride-along with over 50 cameras rolling live, capturing all the actions in real time.
And
as you can imagine, the incidents caught on camera are quite wild. From high-speed chases to daring rescues to intense standoffs, everything in between, it just never stops.
And as the prosecution prepares its opening arguments, the haunting reality lingers. Had emergency responders arrived a few hours later, this case might not be about survival, but a funeral. In the days following the charges, public interest surged, and journalists camped outside the Salt Lake County Courthouse as the first pretrial hearings drew near. Amber Leary was brought in wearing a beige jumpsuit, wrists shackled at her waist, eyes sunken with what could have been either guilt or fatigue, but devoid of visible emotion. Tyrel Belone followed, his frame heavier, his jaw clenched, eyes darting across the courtroom as if scanning for exits. The prosecution made their initial arguments for pretrial detention, citing both defendants as flight risks and threats to public safety. But what riveted the courtroom that morning were the screenshots, projected on a monitor, direct quotes from the text message exchange that painted a chilling portrait of deteriorating control and rising aggression. In one, Balone threatened to crack her skull, just days before CW's hospitalization. Another showed Leary replying, "I'm literally so sorry you have to deal with this," offering sympathy not to her injured child but to the man who would later admit to throwing her. In another, Balone referred to the child as an animal and said he had nothing left to give. These weren't messages exchanged in the heat of the moment. They spanned days, even weeks. Prosecutors leaned in hard, arguing that these weren't just emotional outbursts, they were a prelude to violence, documented in real time. A digital blueprint of escalation. Defense attorneys tried to counter, suggesting the texts were venting hyperbolic frustrations common among overwhelmed parents. But it was difficult to reconcile that narrative with medical reports outlining multiple bruises in various stages of healing, a fractured skull, and signs of sustained trauma. The judge, after hearing both sides, denied bail.
From high-speed
The courtroom
chases
buzzed.
to daring
The decision
rescues
sent
to
a strong
intense
signal.
standoffs,
This
everything in
case would
between,
not be
it just
treated
never
as a
stops.
domestic. Misunderstanding it was a high-stakes prosecution of two individuals accused of the attempted murder of a child. Outside the courthouse, crowds grew. Some carried signs, others whispered prayers. And somewhere, in a guarded hospital room, under dim lighting and beeping monitors, a 3-year-old girl with raccoon bruises under her eyes and bandages around her head was clinging to life. Nurses said she stirred occasionally, blinked, sometimes, whimpered. Her name, still sealed by the court, had become a symbol, a reminder of what happens when silence festers and violence is allowed to hide in plain sight. And as investigators continued tracing the defendants' pasts and covering their history in New Hampshire, cross-checking employment records, Talking to former colleagues, new details emerged that would soon shift the case from horrifying to unimaginable. It began with a background check, routine and procedural. But as Utah investigators cross-referenced the couple's names with out-of-state databases, they discovered what New Hampshire authorities had misstored, perhaps never been informed of. Amber Leary had been involved in 2 prior domestic disturbance calls within the past year, both times dismissed as verbal only, with no visible injuries and no minors reported at the scene. But buried in the notes of one officer's report was a vague mention of a toddler crying in another room. The child's name wasn't recorded. No CPS referral was made. Tyrel Belone's records revealed no prior charges, but his nursing license had quietly lapsed just 3 months before the Utah move. A clerical error, his defense claimed.
It's truly one of my favorite shows on the Reels channel and Reels Plus app. Every Friday and Saturday night, they follow police officers across the country in these high-stakes ride-alongs with over 50 cameras rolling live, capturing all the actions in real time. And as you can imagine, the incidents caught on camera are quite wild. From high-speed chases to daring rescues to intense standoffs, everything in between, it just never stops.
Not just for digital evidence, but for forensic sampling. What they found inside the basement was more than just a mattress and bloodstains. A child-sized training toilet, cracked along its rim, a small plush rabbit missing one ear, and in a corner, tucked under a thin blanket, a security camera unplugged, but with a full SD card still inside. Forensic techs pulled the footage, and though several days had been deleted, the remaining files captured brief, grim snapshots. CW sitting motionless in the corner, CW flinching at footsteps, CW being yanked by one arm, her head snapping back. From the force, the footage alone couldn't confirm who struck her or when the most severe injuries occurred, but it shattered any remaining illusion that this was a one-time loss of temper. The prosecution now had visuals to match the medical records. They showed the footage to the grand jury in a closed session. One juror reportedly cried openly. Another asked to be excused midway through the review. The impact was profound. At the next court date, charges were expanded. The state now sought multiple counts of aggravated child abuse and added obstruction of justice for both defendants. In interviews, prosecutors made it clear they were no longer simply building a case, they were seeking a conviction with maximum sentencing. And as the story made national news, the focus began shifting, not just on the accusee, but on the systems that failed to catch them sooner. Why hadn't New Hampshire CPS flagged Leary? Why wasn't Balone's sudden exit from healthcare settings investigated more thoroughly? Why did it take a near event for the abuse to come to light?
On the Reels channel
Commentators
and
on
Reels
both
Plus
sides of the
every
political
Friday
aisle
and
began
Saturday
weighing
night.
in.
They follow
One
police
cable news
officers
host
across the
labeled it one
country
of the
in these
most disturbing
high-stakes
child welfare
ride-alongs with
breakdowns
over
in recent
50
memory.
cameras
A
rolling
state
live,
senator from
capturing all the
Utah
actions
announced
in
a
real
proposal
time.
to mandate
As you can
immediate
imagine, the
CPS
incidents
review
caught on
for any
camera are
out-of-state
quite
medical
wild.
workers
From high-speed
relocating with
chases
minors.
to daring
And still,
rescues to
at the
intense
center of the storm
standoffs,
was a
everything in
little girl
between, it
awake
just
now,
never
but not
stops.
speaking, not moving. Her recovery, doctors said, would be slow, if she recovered at all. By the third week of July, as the summer heat pressed down on Salt Lake County and national coverage continued to mount, the court released a redacted transcript of Amber Leary's second police interview. What emerged wasn't just damning, it was psychologically revealing. She spoke with halting cadence, alternating between detached confusion and quiet desperation. She claimed Balone hadn't always been like this, that when they met in New Hampshire, he had been attentive, even gentle with CW. He taught her how to count, she said at one point, made her laugh. But her voice trailed off when officers asked why she didn't leave the moment the first bruise appeared. He said I was all she had, Leary whispered. He said no one would believe me. Her statements weren't framed as a defense, but rather as a window into a mindset prosecutors would later call willful submission. In that same interview, detectives confronted her with the surveillance footage retrieved from the basement. Her face crumbled when they played back the audio teeny sounds, barely audible whimpers from CW followed by thudding impacts. Leary turned away from the monitor. I didn't know it was that bad, she murmured, then corrected herself. I didn't want to know. The prosecution seized on that moment. That emotions filed days later. They declared that her passive complicity was a calculated refusal to protect. In response, her attorney requested a psychological evaluation, arguing diminished capacity under duress. But the judge declined to delay the trial. Meanwhile, Tyrel Belone's
truly one of my favorite shows on the Reels channel and Reels Plus app every Friday and Saturday night. They follow police officers across the country in these high-stakes ride-alongs with over 50 cameras rolling live, capturing all the actions in real time. As you can imagine, the incidents caught on camera are quite wild. From high-speed chases to daring rescues to intense standoffs, everything in between, it just never stops.
And the air was so tense that when one woman burst into tears, she was escorted out by a baby. That day, medical experts took the stand. Dr. Lasky returned and delivered detailed testimony, explaining the pattern of soft tissue trauma, the timeline of healing for each bruise, the type of force needed to cause subdural hemorrhage in a toddler's skull. This wasn't a fall, she said. It wasn't a moment of neglect. This was sustained blunt force trauma, inflicted repeatedly. She paused and looked toward the defense table. And it could have killed her. It almost did. The silence that followed was heavier than any gavel. Back in the hospital, CW had begun to move her fingers. Doctors said her vitals were stabilizing, but she still hadn't spoken. A trauma therapist visited daily, holding up flashcards, reading storybooks, waiting. The child blinked, tracked sound. But when the therapist gently asked if she could point to who hurt her, CW turned her face to the wall. Meanwhile, the prosecutors announced they would seek consecutive sentencing if convicted. No overlap. No chance of a short release. The message was clear. They weren't just prosecuting a crime, they were making an example. And for the first time, members of the Utah legislature began circulating internal memos proposing sweeping reforms for child protection laws in out-of-state. Caregiver background checks. The ripple effect of one child's suffering was transforming into a reckoning. But as jury selection loomed, neither Amber Leary nor Tyrel Belone showed remorse. In custody, they remained largely silent. No letters to the court. No
It's truly
apologies.
one of my favorite
No
shows
emotion,
on the Reels
just
channel
the quiet
and Reels
ticking of a
Plus app
clock,
every
winding
Friday
down
and Saturday
toward
night.
trial.
They follow
The
police
first day of
officers
trial
across the
opened under
country
an
in these
overcast
high-stakes
sky,
ride
as if the
along
weight of
with
what was
over
about to
50
be heard
cameras
had
rolling
cast its
live,
own
capturing
shadow
all
over
the
the
actions
courthouse.
in real time.
Jurors
And as you
filed
can
in with
imagine,
sober
the incidents caught on
expressions,
camera are
aware
quite
from the
wild.
outset that
From
what they would
high-speed
hear
chases
might
to
follow them
daring
forever.
rescues
The
to intense
prosecution
standoffs,
wasted no
everything in
time,
between, it
beginning
just
with a
never
montage
stops.
of evidence that rendered the courtroom breathless. Graphic photographs, medical scans, time-stamped text messages, and blurred audio from the basement monitor. The state's opening argument painted a haunting portrait of calculated cruelty inflicted behind closed doors. They recounted each injury, each ignored cry for help, each digital threat typed in anger, and followed by silence. Prosecutors pointed out that both defendants were not only caregivers but trained health professionals, people who were expected to understand the human body, to preserve life, not destroy it. They knew exactly what they were doing, the district attorney said, his voice low but firm, and they chose violence, again and again. Defense attorneys for Amber Leary leaned heavily on the claim of coercion, introducing journals from the last few months in which she described feeling trapped, isolated, and terrified of what he might do next. They attempted to reframe her as a secondary victim, manipulated, controlled, too scared to act. But the prosecution countered with witness testimony from her former colleagues in New Hampshire, one of whom told the jury that Leary was capable, assertive, and not the kind of woman who didn't speak her mind. That contrast, the image of helplessness versus the reality of choice, became the trial's silent war. Tyrel Belone's defense was more brittle. His lawyers claimed emotional stress, fatigue, and a mental health break resulting from relocating, professional burnout, and adjusting to parenthood. But under cross-examination, Belone's claims unraveled. He was asked about a deleted folder in his phone marked discipline logs.
It's truly one of my favorite shows on the Reels channel and Reels Plus app every Friday and Saturday night. They follow police officers across the country in these high-stakes ride-alongs with over 50 cameras rolling live, capturing all the actions in real time. And as you can imagine, the incidents caught on camera are quite wild. From high-speed chases to daring rescues to intense standoffs, everything in between, it just never stops.
Pathologist from Primary Children's Hospital who had been working with CW during recovery, she testified that the child had begun speaking again, only a few words, halting, and only in safe environments. When the pathologist asked CW what had happened to her, the child had whispered, "He threw me." The gallery gasped. One juror turned away. That moment would echo through deliberations. It wasn't just evidence, it was voice. From the victim, herself. Closing arguments began 3 days later. The prosecution reminded jurors of the photos, the texts, the threats, and the medical assessments, but most of all, of CW's whisper. They argued it was not the product of coaching, not imagination, but memory. Defense counsel for Leary pleaded for nuance, asking the jury to distinguish between malice and fear. Belone's lawyers, seeing little path to acquittal, begged only for leniency. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned, the courtroom stilled to a hush. The foreperson stood, voice steady, guilty on all counts for both defendants. Attempted aggravated murder, aggravated child abuse, child torture. The judge did not set a separate sentencing date. Instead, he issued the punishment immediately. Life in prison, consecutive terms. The courtroom murmured. CW's guardian, ad litem, wept. And though CW herself was not present, the system for once seemed to have heard her. Outside the courthouse, community members gathered for a candlelight vigil. No chants, No signs, just silence and flame.
Is truly one of my favorite shows on the Reels channel and Reels Plus app. Every Friday and Saturday night, they follow police officers across the country in these high-stakes ride-alongs with over 50 cameras rolling live, capturing all the actions in real time. And as you can imagine, the incidents caught on camera are quite wild, from high-speed chases to daring rescues to intense standoffs, everything in between. It just never stops.
But the story would never truly fade, not for the jurors, not for the investigators, not for a little girl whose whisper stopped the room.